Okay, now that we've looked at kind of an overview of the application, the example application, and the example data model, let's start looking at the artifacts in the development flow. First, we'll look at the data layer with the entity definition and entity group, and then we'll move on. So, first, the entity definition. The first one we're looking at here is the example entity itself. This is a fairly simple XML file. We do use schemas for everything, so it's nice to have an XML editor that is schema aware and can do auto-completion and validation based on them. For example, looking at this, looking at the entity element, if I hit space here, then I can see the various other attributes associated with it. We won't go over those in detail here. We're just looking at the at how these things are defined. So each entity has an entity name. We'll usually put it in a package. The package is not used at runtime for segmenting the entities. It's just for organization, for the entity reference page and web tools and that sort of thing. So the example, when we're doing an operation with this entity, we just say that we want to do a find by primary key on the example entity, or that sort of thing. And then we pass in an example ID, which is the one primary key field as defined right here. So these are the different fields. This is a primary key and it's a sequenced ID. The entity engine does take care of ID sequencing using a table in the database, so it's independent of the database that it's running on. Example type ID, status ID, and so on. Here we have some relationships, so we're saying the example type ID, it's a type equals 1. So we expect to see one example type given the example type ID that's on this entity. If that's not null, then the foreign key will be enforced by the database. We give it a little foreign key name here, since some databases require very short foreign key names and unique ones. So we do typically manually specify those. We also have a type 1 relationship with a foreign key to the status item entity. The other entities are the same sort of thing, example item with its fields. This has a two-part primary key, so we just have two prime key attributes. Has one relationship to the unit of measure, or UOM entity. Notice that this field name has a prefix on it, amount UOM ID. This is a very common pattern for these sorts of things. When we have a prefix on the field name, so that the field name on this entity is different from the field name on the related entity, we'll also typically put that on the title, in the title for the relationship. So the relationship name becomes the title plus the related entity name. In this case, that would be amount UOM. So when doing, the relationships are helpful not only for defining foreign keys and having the entity engine automatically generate those foreign keys in the database, but say we have a generic value object for the example entity, we can do a getRelated1, just call that method, and pass it the name of the relationship, in this case example type or status item, and we'll get the related entity from the database. We just have to tell it which one we want. In this case we would pass amount UOM as the string, and it would get the related unit of measure using this field mapping that's defined here, so it doesn't have to be done explicitly in the application. Example status, example type, these are all very similar things. You'll notice this one has a self-referencing foreign key. So we have a parent type ID, which is the field on this entity, which points to the example type ID on the parent example type. Here's our example feature entity, example feature application for associating an example and a feature. Notice this has a three-part primary key, example ID, example feature ID, and from date. This is a very common pattern you'll see used in different OFBiz join entities, where we have a from date and a through date. We call this the effective date pattern. And these are typically the names we'll use, from date and through date. Note that these are date time entries and not just a date. So the name is somewhat deceiving, but anyway, this is another common pattern you'll see, the example feature Apple type ID, which points to the example feature Apple type entity. This is the one we discussed before that describes how a feature is associated with an example, such as required or preferred or those sorts of things. It's also very common on a joint entity like this to have a sequence number, so that if you wanted to get all of the example features associated with a certain example in the sequence, in a certain sequence, you can order by this field and get them in that sequence that you want. So another common pattern to talk about that I mentioned a little bit before is the status pattern. So on the example entity, we have a status ID, and it has a foreign key, a one relationship to the status item entity, which is one of the generic OFBiz entities in the common component. There's also an example status entity that keeps a status history. So we have the example ID and status date, and those are the two primary keys. And then we have the status ID that it was previously. It's typically the way that is, or the status ID that it changed to, rather. So if you wanted to see the previous one, you would look at the other entries in the example status entity. Once a data model is defined, there's one other thing that's necessary to get the entity engine to know about it, and that is the entity group. Here you'll see we just put them all in the group org.ofbiz, and even if you create your own entities, you'll typically put them in the same group, org.ofbiz. The entity engine supports a delegation pattern so that different entities can be in different databases. The way that's done is by putting the entities that you want in a different database in a different group, and then when you define your delegator, you specify which data source is associated with each group. And that's done in the entityengine.xml file. So again, when you create your own entities, you would always put them, just like these ones, in the org.ofbiz group. If you had a second database that you wanted to put your entities in, we want the entityengine.xml file. So here is the default delegator. You can see we have org.ofbiz as one group, org.ofbiz.odbc, which is kind of a funny name, but basically these are some entities that are used for integration purposes for a certain implementation to support a shipping package. And so these are meant to be in different databases, so we see that the different group names are associated with different data source names. And the data sources are defined further down here for different databases, different how the entity engine should work with the database, and then in inline JDBC, or it can pull the JDBC connection from JNDI. So this is all just part of configuring Open for Business, and we'll not get into that in detail now. So again, so we have the groups, and we need to define a group for each entity that we define, so that the entity engine knows which data source to use for operations on that entity.